The silence of the house was a shroud, heavy and suffocating, pressing down on my chest until each breath was a conscious effort, a small, hollow victory against the crushing weight of being utterly alone. 75. A milestone, they call it. A number that should have been wreathed in laughter, in the warmth of family, in the slightly off-key chorus of Happy Birthday. Instead, it was marked by the rhythmic tick-tock of the grandfather clock in the hall, each swing of its pendulum a mocking countdown to nothing. My son, David, his wife, Susan, and their 2 children, Chloe and young Tom, were not here. They were, as a brightly filtered photo on Susan's social media page had casually informed me that morning, living their best life, under a sky so blue it hurt my eyes, beside a sea so turquoise it seemed an artist's exaggerated fantasy. The caption, peppered with joyous emojis, detailed the surprise getaway to an exclusive resort in the Maldives, a place whose name I could barely pronounce, let alone imagine visiting. And beneath it, a smaller, almost throwaway line, making memories that will last a lifetime. You only live once. The stab of betrayal was so sharp, so physically painful, it made me gasp, my hand flying to my heart, as if to staunch a wound. It wasn't just their absence on this day, a day David had always made a fuss over, ever since he was a little boy presenting me with lopsided handmade cards. It was the casual cruelty of the reveal, the blatant disregard, and the sickening, dawning realization of how they were affording such extravagance. Using my money, the words formed in my mind, cold and hard as a shard of ice. My money. The careful savings of a lifetime, the legacy left by my dear Arthur, money I had, in a moment of trust that now felt like utter foolishness, given David access to, for investment purposes, he'd said, to make it grow for my future, for my comfort. I looked around the sterile kitchen, the single, slightly sad-looking cupcake I'd bought from the local bakery sitting on the counter, its lone candle unlit. This was my comfort. This echoing silence, this profound aloneness, paid for by their joyous, sun-drenched escape. The irony was a bitter pill, its taste coating my tongue, making the very air feel acrid. I remembered Arthur's warnings, gentle but firm, about David's occasional recklessness, his tendency to be swayed by Susan's more materialistic ambitions. "Be careful, Eleanor," he'd said, his hand warm on mine. Blood is thicker than water, but money can curdle even the thickest cream. I had dismissed it then, loyal to a fault, blinded by a mother's love, by the image of the earnest boy David had once been. Now, Arthur's words echoed in the empty rooms, a haunting premonition fulfilled. The betrayal wasn't just financial, it was a deep, visceral severing of a bond one thought unbreakable. They hadn't just taken my money, they had taken my day, my dignity, my faith in the family I had poured my life into. The roses in my garden, Arthur's prize-winning blooms, seemed to droop in sympathy, their vibrant colors a stark contrast to the grey desolation in my soul. An empty chair at an empty table. That was my celebration. The weight of their betrayal pressed down, and for a long moment, I let it. I let the tears come, hot and silent, tracing paths down cheeks that had known more laughter lines than sorrow. But then, through the haze of grief, a new feeling began to stir, a tiny, hard ember glowing in the ashes of my despair. It was anger, cold and clear, and with it, a surprising, steely resolve. They had underestimated me. They had mistaken my kindness for weakness, my trust for senility. They had forgotten who I was, who I had always been beneath the gentle veneer of mother and grandmother. I was Eleanor Vance, and I was not done yet. The unlit candle on the cupcake seemed to suddenly flicker with a different kind of light, not of celebration, but of a dawning, fierce determination. This was not just my 75th birthday, it was the day I started to fight back. The Maldives, I thought with a sudden, chilling clarity. Let them enjoy the sun. Storm clouds were gathering back home. The web of financial entanglement had been spun with such silken threads of familial trust and loving concern that I, a woman who prided herself on her astuteness, had walked into it willingly, even gratefully. It began subtly, a few years after Arthur passed. David, my David, ever the solicitor's son, started expressing concerns about my well-being, my future. "Mom, you shouldn't have to worry about a thing," he'd said, his brow furrowed with what I then believed was genuine care. "Let me handle the complexities of your portfolio. I have a good head for these things, and Susan's cousin works at a very reputable firm. We can make your money work for you, ensure you have a comfortable and secure old age." The phrase "comfortable and secure old age" became a mantra, a soothing balm he applied liberally whenever he proposed a new financial strategy or suggested consolidating accounts. I remember signing papers, lots of them. He'd bring them over on a Sunday afternoon, usually with Susan and the children in tow, the happy family tableau disarming any nascent skepticism. Chloe would present me with a drawing, Tom would regale me with tales of his latest school exploits, and Susan would fuss over me, bringing my favorite tea, complimenting my garden, her voice like honey, masking the steel trap of her acquisitive nature. David would explain the documents in broad, reassuring strokes. "This just gives me authority to manage this account for you, Mom, to make faster decisions in a volatile market. Or this transfers some funds into a higher yield investment vehicle, more secure in the long run." I, who had managed household budgets and my own modest investments with Arthur for decades, felt a weariness settle in after his death, a desire to shed burdens. David, with his confident pronouncements and apparent financial savvy, seemed like a gift, a way to ease into my later years without the stress of volatile markets and complex tax laws. I granted him power of attorney over certain assets, not all, but enough. Enough, it now seemed, to finance a life of luxury I had never aspired to for myself, let alone for them on my dime. There were small warning signs, of course, tiny red flags that my grief-dulled intuition failed to heed. The increasingly expensive cars they drove, justified by David's success in his vaguely defined consulting business. Susan's designer handbags and Chloe's brand name everything, attributed to smart shopping, and good bonuses. Even their move to a larger house in a more exclusive neighborhood had been framed as an investment, a place where I could eventually have my own suite. Should the need arise, I'd felt a pang of unease then, a sense that their expenditures were outpacing their visible means, but David had always had a plausible explanation, a projection of future earnings, a confident wave of his hand. That dismissed my old-fashioned caution. "You worry too much, Mom. This is how things are done now. You have to spend money to make money." The phrase echoed mockingly in my mind as I pictured them lounging by that turquoise sea. Spend my money to make them memories. The sheer audacity of it was breathtaking. I recalled specific conversations, moments when a sliver of doubt had tried to penetrate my consciousness. Once, I'd asked for a detailed statement of the high-yield investment vehicle, and David had been evasive, producing a glossy brochure from the firm, but no personalized accounting. "It's all very complex, Mom. Quarterly reports. You know I keep an eye on it." He'd then quickly changed the subject, asking about my health, my garden, anything to steer me away from the uncomfortable topic of cold, hard numbers. And I, foolishly, had let him. It was easier to believe in the loving son than to confront the possibility of a calculating manipulator. Easier to trust than to suspect. The truth, now stark and unavoidable, was that my trust had been systematically exploited. My desire for a peaceful old age had been twisted into a resource for their avarice. The internal monologue, which had been a torrent of grief and shock, began to sharpen, to focus. The hurt was still there, a deep, aching void, but now it was accompanied by a burgeoning rage, a righteous fury that burned away the fog of naivety. Arthur would have seen through them in an instant. He would have called David out, demanded accountability. And in that moment, I felt a surge of his strength, his pragmatism. I was not just Arthur's widow, I was his partner. I had a mind of my own, a will of steel that had been dormant, not extinguished. The silence of the house no longer felt like a shroud, it felt like the quiet before a storm, my storm. The fight wouldn't be just about reclaiming money, it would be about reclaiming myself, my judgment, my power. David and Susan had counted on my passivity, on my maternal instinct to forgive, to overlook. They were about to discover just how wrong they were. The initial shock of their sun-drenched betrayal, so casually displayed on Susan's social media, had given way to a chilling clarity, but the true depth of their deceit took a few more days to plumb, days spent in a state of suspended animation, where the only real activity was the frantic whirring of my mind. I started small, driven by a cold fury that was surprisingly methodical. I found the spare key to David's home office, a room in my old house that he had commandeered after they moved in with me temporarily 5 years ago, a temporary stay that had somehow become permanent, transforming my home into their domain, and me into a sort of tolerated, live-in relic. He wasn't usually so careless as to leave financial documents accessible, but perhaps his elation at orchestrating their grand escape had made him sloppy. Or perhaps, more chillingly, he simply didn't consider me a threat, a person capable of investigation. Tucked away in a mislabeled folder under a pile of his business prospectuses, I found them, bank statements, credit card bills linked to accounts I now suspected were fed by my own. My hands trembled, not with age, but with a potent cocktail of rage and revulsion as I spread the papers across my small kitchen table, the one piece of furniture in the house that still felt truly mine. The statements painted a lurid picture of profligacy. Thousands on designer clothes I'd never seen Susan wear in my presence, extravagant dinners at city restaurants I'd only read about, spa days, golf club memberships, even a down payment on a new sports car for David, a sleek, ostentatious beast I'd briefly seen and been told was a company car, and then, the vacation. The charges for first-class flights, the exorbitant rate for the Maldivian villa, excursions, private dinners on the beach, it was all there, itemized in cold, hard print, a monument to their greed, built with the bricks of my life savings. Each entry was a fresh stab, a new layer of betrayal. This wasn't just a spontaneous trip, this was a meticulously planned plunder, a grand finale to years of systematic siphoning. The sheer scale of it was staggering. It was clear they weren't just borrowing, or investing badly, they were actively, consciously defrauding me. The contrast between their opulent holiday and my stark, lonely 75th birthday celebration, that single, unlit cupcake, became almost unbearable. I imagined Susan, draped in new silks, sipping champagne, laughing her tinkling, false laugh, while David, puffed up with a sense of his own cleverness, toasted their good fortune. Did they ever spare a thought for me, the source of their bounty? Or was I just a tiresome old woman, conveniently out of sight, out of mind, her only remaining purpose to be an open wallet? The feeling of being discarded was profound, like being tossed onto a scrap heap after my usefulness had expired. But alongside the pain, the ember of resolve I'd felt on my birthday now burned hotter, fanned by each fresh piece of evidence. They would not get away with this. They would not reduce me to a footnote in their lavish story. It was then that Martha's face swam into my mind, sharp, intelligent, with eyes that missed nothing. Martha Klein, my friend from college, a woman who had shattered glass ceilings in the legal world when most women were still expected to shatter nothing more than their own ambitions. We hadn't seen each other in years, life having pulled us in different directions, but I knew she was still practicing, a renowned litigator. If anyone could help me navigate this treacherous terrain, it was Martha. The thought of contacting her sent a jolt of adrenaline through me, a sense of purpose that was almost exhilarating. This wouldn't be easy. Confronting David, my own son, would be like tearing out a piece of my own heart, however corrupted that piece had become. But the alternative, to let them continue, to fade away into impoverished irrelevance while they lived high on my life's work, was unthinkable. I picked up the phone, my hand surprisingly steady. Finding Martha's firm online was easy, her reputation preceded her. The conversation with her assistant was brief, professional. I left a message, my voice low but firm, stating my name and the urgent, personal nature of my call. As I waited for her to return it, I looked at the damning pile of papers on my table. They were no longer just symbols of betrayal, they were weapons. And I was finally ready to learn how to use them. The house was still quiet, but it was a different kind of quiet now, not the silence of despair, but the charged stillness of a gathering storm, a storm of my own making. And I, Eleanor Vance, was its I. Martha Klein's voice, when it finally came through the phone line later that afternoon, was exactly as I remembered, crisp, no nonsense, yet with an underlying warmth that had always made her approachable despite her formidable intellect. Eleanor Vance. Good heavens, it's been an age. I trust this isn't just a social call, given the urgency your assistant relayed. There was a slight smile in her tone, and I felt a flicker of the old camaraderie, a sense of relief so profound it almost buckled my knees. No, Martha, it's not, I said, my voice steadier than I expected. I'm in trouble. Serious trouble, and I believe you're the only person who can help me. I laid it all out, the lonely birthday, the social media post, the subsequent horrifying discoveries in David's office, the years of misplaced trust, the systematic draining of my funds. I spoke for nearly an hour, the words tumbling out, a torrent of pain, anger, and dawning resolution. Martha listened patiently, interrupting only for brief, clarifying questions, her legal mind already sifting through the emotional debris for the hard facts. There were no expressions of shock or pity, for which I was grateful. Instead, her responses were pragmatic, focused. Power of attorney, you said. For which account specifically? Were there any limitations stated in the document? Joint accounts, were they and all or signatories? Eleanor, I need every piece of paper you can find. Bank statements, any agreements you signed, copies of wills, property deeds, anything that shows the flow of money and the authority David believed he had. Her questions were like a surgeon's scalpel, precise and incisive, cutting away the sentimentality to get to the heart of the matter. For the first time in days, I felt a spark of something other than despair or rage, hope. It was a fragile thing, but it was there, kindled by Martha's calm competence. He always said it was for my comfortable and secure old age, I told her, the phrase tasting like ash in my mouth. Instead, he secured himself a very comfortable present, the oldest trick in the book, unfortunately, Martha said dryly. Exploiting familial trust. Judges see it all the time, Eleanor, and they don't like it. But we need to build an airtight case. This won't be just about getting your money back. It's about ensuring he can't do this again, to you or anyone else, and potentially, about reporting elder financial abuse. The term elder financial abuse hung in the air, stark and ugly. It was what this was, wasn't it? Not just a family squabble over money, but a crime. A betrayal so profound it had legal ramifications. The thought was both terrifying and strangely empowering. What do I do now? I asked, feeling like a ship that had been adrift now finally sighting a lighthouse. Gather everything, Martha instructed. Every statement, every email, every note. Make copies. Write down every conversation you can remember regarding finances with David and Susan, dates, what was said, any promises made. Details are our ammunition, Eleanor. The more you have, the stronger our position. She paused, then her voice softened slightly. And Eleanor, take care of yourself. This is a marathon, not a sprint. It's going to be emotionally brutal. But you're not alone in this anymore. Hearing those words, "You're not alone," was like a balm to a raw wound. The strategic planning had begun. My kitchen table, once a symbol of my lonely birthday, transformed into a war room. The single cupcake was long gone, replaced by stacks of documents, highlighted statements, and notebooks filled with my increasingly precise recollections. The work was grueling, each receipt for a lavish dinner they'd enjoyed, each withdrawal slip for cash I never saw, a fresh twist of the knife. But with each piece of evidence, my resolve hardened. I was no longer just a victim. I was an investigator, an archivist of my own betrayal, meticulously building the case against my own son. The roses outside my window, Arthur's roses, seemed to stand a little straighter, their thorns more prominent. They were beautiful, yes, but they were also resilient, capable of defending themselves. And so, I learned, was I. The days that followed my initial call with Martha settled into a new, grim rhythm. My house, once a place of cherished memories and, more recently, a mausoleum of lonely grief, became an archive of deceit. I unearthed boxes from the attic, files from the back of closets. Sifting through decades of financial history, my life laid bare in a series of transactions, deposits, and now, horrifyingly, unauthorized withdrawals. Each bank statement from the accounts David managed was a testament to his audacity and Susan's rapacious appetite. Lavish shopping sprees at boutiques whose names I didn't recognize, charges for luxury car services, hefty sums transferred to accounts I had no knowledge of. It was a systematic plunder, executed with a chilling efficiency that belied the loving son persona he so effortlessly projected. The sheer banality of some of the expenses was almost as offensive as the larger ones: daily gourmet coffees, expensive takeout meals when my own meticulously prepared food sat uneaten in the refrigerator, subscriptions to frivolous online services. It was a constant, leaching drain, 1,000 tiny cuts alongside the major hemorrhages. My internal monologue during this period was a maelstrom. One moment, I'd be consumed by a white-hot rage, imagining confronting David, the words I would hurl at him, the accusations. The next, a wave of profound sadness would wash over me, mourning the son I thought I had, the family I believed was mine. I recalled David as a boy, earnest and kind, always eager to please. Where had that boy gone? Had he always been there, this grasping, duplicitous man, hidden beneath a veneer of filial piety? Or had Susan, with her insatiable desire for status and material possessions, slowly corrupted him, fanning the flames of some latent greed I had been too blind to see? I remembered instances of her subtle manipulations, her way of making David feel inadequate if he didn't provide the lifestyle she craved. "Oh, it's just a little something," she'd say, twirling a new diamond bracelet. David got a wonderful bonuses that, I now suspected, were funded by my dwindling nest egg. The meticulous process of gathering evidence was emotionally draining. Some nights, I would just sit at the kitchen table, surrounded by papers, and weep for Arthur, for the future I had envisioned, for the trust so callously shattered. But Martha's voice, calm and resolute during our daily check-in calls, always pulled me back. "Focus, Eleanor. Emotion is understandable, but evidence wins cases." She was right. My grief wouldn't recover my savings, my anger, unchanneled, would only consume me. So, I channeled it. I became a forensic accountant of my own life, tracing every penny, cross-referencing dates, highlighting discrepancies. I remembered a conversation years ago, when I'd given David a substantial sum from Arthur's life insurance. "Invest it wisely, David," I'd said. "This is for emergencies, for my long-term care, should I need it." He had looked me in the eye, his expression so sincere. "Of course, Mom. I'll treat it as if it were my own." Oh, the irony. He had treated it as his own, to spend as frivolously and selfishly as possible. I found the initial investment proposal from the firm Susan's cousin supposedly worked for. A quick online search revealed the firm was legitimate, but further digging, prompted by Martha, showed the specific high-yield fund David had mentioned was known for its opacity and high commission structure, often pushed by less scrupulous advisors. Had Susan's cousin been complicit, or merely incompetent? Or had David bypassed him altogether, using the firm's name as a smokescreen? These were questions for Martha to pursue. My task was to provide the raw material. And so I did, with a grim determination that surprised even myself. The woman who had felt so broken and alone on her 75th birthday was slowly being replaced by someone else, someone tougher, more focused, fueled by a righteous anger and an unshakable resolve to see justice done. The roses in the garden were in full bloom now, their vibrant colors a stark contrast to the darkness I was wading through. But I took strength from them. They faced the sun, unbowed, their thorns a clear warning. I was finding my own thorns. Martha's legal assessment, when it came, was delivered with her characteristic blend of brisk professionalism and understated empathy. We sat in her surprisingly unpretentious office, a room filled with books rather than ostentatious displays of success, the scent of old paper, and strong coffee hanging in the air. The piles of documents I had painstakingly gathered, bank statements, annotated agreements, timelines of conversations, were neatly stacked on her large mahogany desk, a testament to weeks of emotionally wrenching labor. "Eleanor," she began, her gaze direct, "the evidence is compelling. What we have here is a clear pattern of misappropriation of funds, and, I believe, a strong case for breach of fiduciary duty under the power of attorney. David systematically abused your trust and his legal authority." Hearing it stated so boldly by a legal expert, stripped of the emotional baggage, was both validating and deeply chilling. It wasn't just my hurt feelings, it was a verifiable offense. The power of attorney you granted him was specific in its intent, for managing your investments for your benefit and future care, Martha continued, tapping a highlighted clause in one of the documents. It was not a license to fund his and Susan's extravagant lifestyle. The sheer volume of personal expenditures, the transfers to their personal accounts, the financing of that ludicrous vacation, it's all here, she gestured to the stacks of paper. We can demonstrate a clear diversion of funds that had no conceivable benefit to you. In fact, it was actively detrimental to your financial security. The legal power turns were beginning to crystallize. Martha outlined a multi-pronged strategy. First, a formal letter of demand to David, outlining the misappropriated amounts and demanding immediate restitution. This would be followed, if necessary, by freezing any accounts they held jointly with me, or accounts into which my funds had been improperly transferred, if we could trace them quickly enough. Then, the more serious step, filing a civil lawsuit to recover the assets, and potentially reporting the matter to Adult Protective Services and the District Attorney for investigation into elder financial abuse. This will get ugly, Eleanor, Martha warned, her expression serious. They will likely react with denial, anger, perhaps even try to portray you as confused or vindictive. Are you prepared for that? I thought of my lonely birthday, of the casual cruelty in Susan's smiling vacation photos, of the years of lies and manipulation. I thought of Arthur's hard-earned money, squandered on fleeting pleasures while my own future was jeopardized. A new strength, forged in the fires of betrayal and honed by Martha's guidance, coursed through me. Yes, Martha, I said, my voice surprisingly firm. I am prepared. They mistook my kindness for weakness for far too long. It's time they saw the steel beneath, Martha nodded, a flicker of something like approval in her eyes. Good. Because we will need that steel, she explained the complexities of tracing assets, especially if David had been clever about moving money through various accounts, or shell entities. Susan's cousin's investment firm, she mused, will need to look into their role. Were they negligent or complicit? That's another avenue. The protagonist, me, Eleanor Vance, was indeed evolving. The initial shock and grief had given way to a focused anger, and now, that anger was being channeled into strategic action. I was no longer just a victim of their deceit. I was an active participant in the fight for justice. There was a grim satisfaction in this transformation, a reclaiming of agency that was almost as important as reclaiming the money itself. We discussed the potential involvement of my grandchildren, Chloe and Tom. Chloe, at 17, was old enough to have some awareness, though perhaps she was caught in her parents' web of entitlement. Tom was younger, more innocent. What about them? I asked, a pang of residual grandmotherly concern piercing through my anger. Legally, they are minors and not directly culpable unless they knowingly participated in fraudulent activity, which is unlikely to be provable, Martha said. The focus will be on David and Susan. However, the fallout will undoubtedly affect the children. That's an unfortunate reality of these situations. I absorbed this, another painful consequence of my son's actions. But my resolve didn't waver. Protecting my grandchildren in the long run meant stopping their parents' destructive behavior, not shielding them from the necessary consequences. As I left Martha's office that day, the city streets seemed a little brighter, my step a little lighter, despite the daunting path ahead. The legal machinery was now in motion. The slow burn of my pain was igniting a controlled fire of legal retribution. David and Susan were still basking in the Maldivian sun, oblivious. But their world was about to be rocked. The first salvo was about to be fired. The first official act of war, as I privately termed it, was a letter. Not just any letter, but a thick, menacing envelope bearing the distinguished letterhead of Martha Klein's law firm. It was sent via registered mail, requiring a signature, to David and Susan at my address, their address, as they'd come to consider it, and, crucially, a copy was couriered directly to the Maldivian resort where they were living their best life. Martha had a contact, a tenacious investigator she sometimes used, who managed to ascertain their exact villa number and ensure the package would be hand-delivered. I imagined the scene, the intrusion of stark reality into their sun-drenched, champagne-fueled fantasy. The letter itself was a masterpiece of legal precision and thinly veiled threat. It detailed, in cold, unequivocal terms, the extent of the misappropriated funds, referencing specific account numbers and dates. It demanded full restitution within 7 business days, outlined the immediate steps we would take if the demand was not met, including freezing assets and initiating legal proceedings, and strongly hinted at the criminal implications of elder financial abuse. Martha had included copies of key documents, the power of attorney with its limitations highlighted, and a summary statement showing the most egregious expenditures, including the full, itemized cost of their current vacation. There was no room for misinterpretation, no soft peddling of the accusations. It was a declaration of intent. For 3 days after the letter was dispatched, an unnerving silence descended. I found myself jumpy, starting at every ring of the phone, every car that slowed on the street. Martha had warned me this was likely. They would be scrambling, consulting their own, undoubtedly less scrupulous, legal counsel, or perhaps just stunned into inaction. Then, on the 4th day, the call came. It was David, his voice a bizarre cocktail of bluster, disbelief, and a pathetic attempt at his old, wheedling charm. "Mom? What is this nonsense Martha Klein sent us? Are you all right? Has someone been putting ideas in your head?" The sheer audacity of his opening gambit almost made me laugh. "I am perfectly all right, David," I replied, my voice colder than I thought possible. And the only ideas in my head are based on the bank statements detailing how you and Susan have systematically plundered my savings to finance your ridiculous lifestyle." There was a sputtering sound on the other end. Plundered. Mom, that's a terrible word. We were managing your finances, making them grow. This was a celebration of some successful investments, a chance for the family to bond. A chance for my family to bond using my money, you mean? I shot back, one of Martha's prepared sharp comebacks rolling off my tongue with surprising ease. Successful investments. David, the only thing that seems to have grown is your capacity for deceit and Susan's wardrobe. I have seen the statements. I know exactly where my money has gone, including every last cent for your Maldivian bonding experience." His tone shifted then, from faint concern to outright anger. "How dare you? After everything Susan and I do for you, living in that big house, keeping you company." "Keeping me company?" I interjected, my own anger rising. "You mean isolating me, making me a prisoner in my own home, while you spent my money as if it were water? And as for everything you do for me, the only thing you seem to have done proficiently is commit fraud." There was a sharp intake of breath. Susan's voice, shrill and indignant, suddenly cut in. "Eleanor, this is outrageous. David has worked tirelessly. We deserved this break. You're just a bitter old woman, jealous of our happiness." "Jealous, Susan?" I said, my voice dangerously quiet. "No. I am many things right now: disappointed, furious, betrayed, but jealous of people who steal from their own mother." "Hardly. As for being a bitter old woman, you might find this old woman has a few surprisingly sharp teeth when provoked. Martha Klein is not known for sending frivolous letters. You have until the deadline she specified to respond substantively. Otherwise, the consequences will escalate. And believe me, they will be far more damaging to your happiness than my alleged bitterness." I could hear frantic whispering in the background, then David came back on, his voice strained. "Mom, look, there must be some misunderstanding. We can talk about this when we get back. We'll sort it out. The time for talking it out, as if this were a minor disagreement, is over, David," I stated firmly. "You will deal with Martha. And I suggest you cut your luxurious vacation short. The funds you're using are, shall we say, under scrutiny. It would be a shame if your credit cards suddenly stopped working with that." I hung up, my hand trembling slightly, but my heart filled with a strange, fierce satisfaction. The first shot had been fired, and it had hit its mark. The burst of tension was palpable, even across continents. They knew I was serious. They knew I had backing. Their sun-drenched paradise was about to become very, very uncomfortable. The power shift had begun. The carefully constructed facade of David and Susan's life began to crumble with surprising speed after that phone call. Their initial bluster quickly gave way to a panicked awareness that their gravy train had not just been derailed, but was about to crash spectacularly. Martha, true to her word, had already initiated procedures to freeze a joint savings account David had cajoled me into setting up years ago, an account he had been systematically draining. The first tangible consequence for them, I later learned, was when Susan attempted to purchase an obscenely expensive souvenir, a diamond tennis bracelet, no less, at the resort's high-end boutique, only to have her credit card declined. Not just one, but several. The cascade had begun. Their indignant, then increasingly desperate, calls started coming more frequently. No longer to me. I had instructed Martha that all communication was to go through her, but to Martha's office. Her paralegal, a wonderfully stoic woman named Sarah, recounted some of the exchanges to me with a degree of professional amusement. David, apparently, had tried everything: feigned remorse, threats of countersuing for defamation, which Martha found particularly laughable, appeals to family loyalty, and even attempts to paint me as mentally incompetent and easily manipulated by a predatory lawyer. Susan's contributions were apparently less strategic and more radical, a torrent of abuse and self-pity. Martha handled it all with icy calm, reiterating our demands and the rapidly approaching deadline. The poetic justice of their Maldivian idyll turning into a financial nightmare was not lost on me. I imagined them, trapped in paradise, their luxurious villa suddenly feeling like a gilded cage as their access to my stolen funds dried up. The resort, no doubt, would not be extending them credit indefinitely. The real blow, however, came when Martha's investigator, a veritable bloodhound when it came to financial trails, uncovered that David had recently transferred a significant six-figure sum of money I recognized as coming from the sale of some bonds Arthur had left me into a newly opened offshore account in a jurisdiction known for its banking secrecy. This was no longer just foolish extravagance, this was calculated, criminal intent to hide assets. "This is excellent, Eleanor," in a terrible way, Martha had said, her voice grim but resolute. "This demonstrates premeditation and a clear attempt to defraud you on a significant scale. It strengthens our hand immensely, both in civil recovery and for any potential criminal complaint. Armed with this new evidence, Martha filed an emergency petition with the court to place a lien on their primary assets in this country, including the house, my house, which David had, through some legal chicanery I was only now beginning to understand, managed to get his name onto the deed alongside mine. The court, presented with the evidence of the offshore transfer and the pattern of abuse, granted the preliminary injunction. The news reached David and Susan just as they were apparently trying to negotiate an early, and considerably less luxurious, flight home. Their vacation was definitively over. They returned not to a welcoming home and a compliant mother, but to a brewing legal storm and a house that was now a contested asset. The confrontation, when it finally happened, was less dramatic than I had envisioned, yet more profoundly satisfying. They arrived looking harried, sunburnt, and thoroughly defeated. Susan's eyes were red-rimmed, her usual immaculate coiffure disheveled. David looked older, grayer, the arrogant confidence completely stripped away. They tried to approach me, to talk, to appeal to my maternal instincts. David started with a quavering, "Mom, please, we need to sort this out, just us." I stood my ground, Martha's advice echoing in my ears. "There is nothing for just us to sort out, David," I said, my voice even, devoid of the tremor I felt inside. "You will speak to my lawyer. This house, as you know, is now subject to a court order. I suggest you find alternative accommodation." Susan let out a strangled sob. "Alternative accommodation? This is our home. You can't just throw us out." "Actually, Susan," I replied, looking directly at her, the years of swallowed resentments finding voice, "this is my home. A home you and David have treated as your personal piggy bank and five-star hotel for far too long. And yes, it appears I can, with the help of the law, reclaim what is mine." The empty chairs in my dining room, once a symbol of my lonely birthday, now seemed to represent their lost entitlement, their forfeited place at my table, in my life. The power had well and truly shifted. They were no longer in control. I was. The fight was far from over, but this victory, this reclamation of my home and my dignity, was immense. The fallout was messy, protracted, and deeply unpleasant, as Martha had warned. David and Susan, facing the grim reality of their situation, frozen accounts, a lien on the house, and the very real threat of criminal charges, hired a lawyer who attempted a series of desperate, delay tactic maneuvers. There were offers of partial repayment, sob stories about their children's welfare, a card they played with nauseating frequency, and even attempts to discredit me, suggesting I was confused or being unduly influenced. But Martha was a rock, countering every move with sharp legal precision and the undeniable weight of evidence. The offshore account David had so cleverly set up proved to be his undoing. Martha, with her network of international legal contacts, managed to initiate proceedings in that jurisdiction as well. While recovery from such havens is notoriously difficult, the very act of its discovery and the clear intent to hide assets weighed heavily against him in the domestic courts. The most painful part was seeing the impact on Chloe and Tom. Chloe, at 17, was old enough to understand the broad strokes of what her parents had done, and I saw a mixture of anger, confusion, and shame in her eyes during one brief, court-mandated encounter. Tom, younger and more bewildered, just seemed sad. I made it clear through Martha that my fight was with David and Susan, not with my grandchildren. I even set up a small, separate trust for their future education, funded by what little remained of my personal, untouched savings, ensuring it was managed by an independent trustee, far from their parents' grasping hands. It was a small gesture, but it was important to me that they not be entirely punished for their parents' greed. The poetic justice continued to unfold. David's vague, consulting business, which I now realized was largely a sham propped up by my money, collapsed entirely. Susan, stripped of her ability to fund her extravagant tastes, found herself having to look for actual employment, a prospect that seemed to fill her with horror. They were forced to move out of my house, into a cramped rental apartment, a stark come down from the spacious comfort they had taken for granted. The legal battle culminated not in a dramatic courtroom showdown, but in a mediated settlement. Faced with overwhelming evidence and the prospect of a public trial that would expose the full extent of their deceit, David and Susan capitulated. They agreed to sign over their interest in my house completely, liquidate what few legitimate assets they had left to begin repaying a portion of what they had stolen, and consented to a legally binding agreement that prevented them from having any control over my finances or estate ever again. The amount recovered was not the full sum they had squandered, much of it was gone, vanished into the ether of their luxurious living, but it was enough. Enough for me to live comfortably, to secure my future, and most importantly, enough to represent a victory. A moral victory, a legal victory, and a deeply personal one. The day the final papers were signed, I didn't feel elation, but a quiet, profound sense of relief, and a certain grim satisfaction. The empty chairs at my family table would remain empty of them, perhaps for good. But my life was no longer defined by their absence or their betrayal. I had faced the worst of it and emerged, not unscathed, but whole and stronger. I had reclaimed not just a portion of my money, but my home, my independence, and my self-respect. The roses in my garden, Arthur's roses, were in their final, glorious bloom of the season, their scent filling the air. They had weathered storms before, and so had I. This victory wasn't just about revenge, it was about reclaiming the narrative of my own life. The aftermath of the storm was a period of quiet recalibration. The house, once echoing with my lonely grief and then later with the tense energy of legal battles, slowly began to feel like home again, my home. The silence was no longer oppressive, it was peaceful, filled with the gentle rhythm of my own life, reclaimed and reordered. I had my financial independence back, not to the extent it was before David and Susan's systematic plunder, but enough to live without fear, to make my own choices. The roses blooming as revenge took on a literal meaning. One of the first things I did with a small portion of the recovered funds was to hire a landscape gardener, not to change Arthur's beloved rose garden, but to enhance it, to add new varieties, to build a small, sun-drenched patio where I could sit and read, a place just for me. It was a symbol of new growth, of beauty cultivated from the ashes of betrayal. The triumph was not a loud, boisterous affair, but a quiet, internal settling. It was in the simple act of making coffee in my own kitchen without the undercurrent of resentment, of walking through my garden without feeling the weight of their entitlement. It was in the newfound strength I discovered within myself, the resilience I hadn't known I possessed until it was tested so severely. Martha remained a steadfast friend, our bond forged in the crucible of crisis. We met for lunch occasionally, our conversations ranging far beyond legal matters, into books, art, and the simple absurdities of life. Her fierce advocacy had been my shield, but her quiet friendship became a comfort. My relationship with David and Susan was, for all intents and purposes, over. There were no more angry phone calls, no desperate appeals. Just a vast, empty space where a family connection used to be. It was a loss, and I allowed myself to grieve it, but it was a necessary amputation. The cancer of their greed had threatened to consume me, and cutting them out, however painful, had been essential for my survival. As for Chloe and Tom, the trust one had established for their education was my way of maintaining a thread, however thin, to my grandchildren, without enabling their parents. Chloe sent me a hesitant, handwritten letter a few months later, a tentative olive branch. It was filled with teenage angst and a dawning understanding of her parents' culpability. I replied kindly but cautiously. Healing, if it were ever to happen, would be a long and complex process, and not one I was prepared to rush or force. The legal power turns had been decisive, the emotional symbolism profound. The empty chairs were still there, a reminder of what was lost, but also a testament to what had been reclaimed, my autonomy. I was no longer defined by my role as a mother or grandmother to be exploited, but as Eleanor Vance, a woman of substance, of resilience, of quiet power. My 75th birthday had been a day of profound desolation. My 76th, I decided, would be different. I wouldn't wait for others to celebrate me. I would celebrate myself. Perhaps a small trip, somewhere peaceful, by the sea. Not the Maldives, of course. Somewhere simpler, more authentic. A place where the only currency required was an appreciation for the quiet beauty of the world, and the hard-won peace of a life reclaimed. The catharsis was in this quiet rebuilding, this empowered solitude. The storm had passed, and in its wake, I found not bitterness, but a renewed sense of self, a quiet strength that bloomed, much like Arthur's roses, vibrant and enduring. I had faced betrayal and emerged, not just a survivor, but a woman redefined, standing tall in her own reclaimed garden.